I have always been the quiet one. Not quiet in the way people mean when they say it kindly, not thoughtful or reserved or mysterious. Quiet in the way that families assign roles and then forget to update them. Quiet in the way that once you've been decided upon, no evidence to the contrary seems to stick. I was the youngest of 3 cousins on my father's side, the one who didn't go to the right school, didn't marry the right person, didn't live in the right zip code. I was, by the family's consensus, the one who had simply never figured it out. Had been that person since approximately the age of 22, and the family had been so consistent in this belief, so unified and so settled in it, that after a while it had stopped feeling like opinion and started feeling like weather. Something you moved about. Something you dressed for. My Uncle Gerald had been delivering that verdict for the better part of 20 years. Gerald Donovan was not a subtle man. He was loud in the way that people who've never had to be careful tend to be loud. Big voice, big opinions, big handshakes that lasted a half-second too long. He had built Donovan Construction from a regional outfit into something that, by his own frequent accounting, employed over 200 people and had its name on half the highway signs in the state. He told this story at every holiday gathering, every birthday dinner, every occasion that warranted a toast, and several that did not. Gerald believed in himself the way some people believe in weather, as a fact so obvious it required no argument. He was the kind of man who ordered for the table without asking, who interrupted stories to correct details that didn't need correcting, who called waitstaff by first name 2 minutes after meeting them. Confident in the old-fashioned, unreflective sense of the word. Kind of confidence that has never been seriously tested and therefore has no idea what it actually cost. He also believed with equal conviction that I was a cautionary tale. It hadn't always been that way. When I was young, he'd been almost fond of me. The kind of uncle who ruffled your hair and called you kid and slipped you a 20 when your parents weren't looking. He'd been the one who told me when I was about 12 that I had a good head on my shoulders. I had remembered that. Children remember those things. But somewhere around the time I left my hometown without explanation and stopped showing up to things, his affection had curdled into something closer to contempt. I had, in his estimation, wasted every advantage, squandered every opportunity, and ended up with nothing to show for it. The fact that I rarely corrected this impression was not something he interpreted as dignity. He interpreted it as confirmation. I had let him interpret it that way for years. It was easier. And honestly, some part of me had always known that the moment I stopped being quiet, things would get complicated in ways I wasn't prepared to manage at Thanksgiving dinner. Thanksgiving that year was at my Aunt Carla's house, the same as always. The same harvest-themed centerpiece on the table, the same good china that only came out twice a year, the same seating arrangement that had been unchanged since the early 2000s. Carla was Gerald's sister, my father's sister-in-law, and the kind of woman who held families together through sheer organizational willpower. The one who sent the group texts, kept the shared calendar, remembered every birthday and every dietary restriction and every long-standing grievance, and somehow managed to seat people around a table in a way that minimized the worst of the damage. He was good at this. She'd had years of practice. I drove up from the city on Wednesday evening, checked into the same motel off the highway that I always used, and arrived at Carla's door at noon on Thursday with a bottle of wine and every intention of getting through the meal without incident. I almost managed it. The trouble started around the time the turkey was carved. There were 14 of us at the table. Carla and her husband Bill, my parents Gerald and his wife Patrice, 3 of my cousins with their spouses, and 2 children who were mercifully seated at the far end and absorbed in their own world. I was between my mother and my cousin, Danny, which was generally a safe arrangement. Danny didn't ask many questions. He was primarily interested in football and had the comfortable conversational habit of filling silence with sports commentary, which suited me fine. It was Gerald who brought me into the conversation. He was in the middle of a story about a new project, something involving a federal infrastructure bid, a point of particular pride. When he paused, looked down the table at me and smiled. It was the kind of smile that has already decided what it wants to say before the mouth opens. The kind that doesn't need the rest of the face to participate. You know, he said, setting down his fork and addressing the table generally, the way he did when he was transitioning from a story to a thesis. I've been thinking lately about the people who make it and the people who don't. He reached for his wine. And I think the difference is pretty simple. It's people who show up and people who don't. People who decide to do something and then do it. It's not complicated. Nobody responded. This was not unusual. Gerald's observations rarely invited response so much as audience. They were structured as conclusions, not as openings. The table waited. Every family has one, he continued, and he looked directly at me. Not a glance. A full, deliberate look, the kind you give someone when you want them to understand. They are the subject and not just the occasion. A person who never quite. He made a vague gesture with his fork. A gesture that somehow encompassed underachievement, missed potential, and general disappointment in a single lazy arc. Got there. Family's lucky. We've only got one. He smiled broadly at the rest of the table, making the rounds, gathering nods. And ours is sitting right there. The table laughed. Not everyone. My mother's expression went very still in the way it did when she was deciding whether to say something, and Carla suddenly became occupied with the cranberry sauce with an intensity that suggested she had found something extremely interesting in it. But enough people laughed. Danny looked at his plate. My cousin Rebecca's husband looked at the ceiling. Gerald looked satisfied in the way that men look satisfied when they have said a thing they've been wanting to say, and nobody has stopped them. I cut my turkey. Fair enough, I said. Gerald waited, I think, for more. For defensiveness or embarrassment or the tight-lipped dignity of someone who wanted to respond but couldn't find the words. He was watching me with the expectant look of someone who has thrown a stone into water and is waiting for the ripples. When he didn't get them, he moved on. The conversation shifted to football, then to a controversy at the school board, then back inevitably to the ongoing subject of Gerald's federal contract. The contract was real and it was significant. Donovan Construction had been awarded a federal infrastructure project, highway resurfacing and drainage improvements across 3 counties, managed under a regional transportation authority with a total value of $7.2 million. Gerald had been pursuing this contract for 2 years. He had mentioned it at Christmas, at Easter, at his son Marcus Jr.'s graduation party in June, and now in considerable detail at Thanksgiving. It was by any measure the biggest thing his company had ever done. Was also, I noted as he talked, managed through a contracting authority that I happened to have a working relationship with. I listened to him describe the project timeline and said nothing. I excused myself after the main course before dessert and walked outside. Carla's backyard in late November is not a comfortable place to stand. It was cold, the kind of dry Midwestern cold that comes in off flat ground and finds you immediately. No mercy, no wind chill warning, but I needed a moment away from the sound of that table. I stood on the back porch, hands in my coat pockets, and looked at the yard. The garden had been put to bed for winter, brown and flattened under a thin frost. The neighbor's dog was barking at something. A car passed on the road out front. Ordinary sounds from an ordinary Thursday. I thought about what I'd built. I had not always been the family embarrassment. That was the thing I never said out loud, because saying it would require a longer conversation than any holiday gathering aloud, and because the proof of it would raise questions I wasn't ready to answer in that setting. Questions like, why hadn't I said anything sooner? Why had I let them think what they thought for 11 years? The honest answer was that it hadn't seemed necessary. I had not needed my family's understanding to do what I was doing. It had needed clients and capital and good people and a great deal of patience, none of which Gerald Donovan could provide, and so his opinion of me had simply not been a resource I required. But the fact was that I had, over the past 11 years, built something real. Not loudly. Not in a way that sent press releases to relatives or posted milestone updates to social media or required a toast at Thanksgiving. But real, documented, verifiable. Something. My company, a federal infrastructure and project management consultancy, I had started in a 1-bedroom apartment 11 years ago with a borrowed laptop, a former colleague who believed in the idea, and one small municipal client that had found us through a local government directory, now operated across 4 states. We had 43 full-time employees and 24 long-term contractors. We had been awarded federal contracts in transportation infrastructure, environmental compliance, and municipal development planning. We had an office in the city and satellite operations in 2 other metros. Our revenue for the fiscal year just ended was just under $60 million, and we were projected to clear 80 the following year pending several bids currently in evaluation. I was, in the language that Gerald Donovan would have recognized immediately, a significant player in exactly the industry in which he had spent his career. He just didn't know it. I had never told him. I had never told any of them. The company operated under a corporate name that had nothing to do with mine, and I had been careful over the years not to bring my professional life into the family's orbit. This was not deception exactly. It was more like compartmentalization. The family believed what they believed, and I lived my life in the city, and the 2 things had not needed to intersect. Until tonight, standing on a cold porch in November, they still didn't need to. I took out my phone. I scrolled to a contact named Marcus Webb, my federal contracts liaison, the person who managed our relationships with government contracting agencies and subcontractor networks across the regions where we operated. Marcus had been with me for 6 years. He was meticulous, experienced, and possessed of an almost uncanny instinct for the unspoken dimensions of a request. He had never once asked me to explain something I clearly didn't want to explain. I typed, Marcus, Donovan Construction. They're a mid-size regional contractor. Probably in your system. Remove them from our approved subcontractor vendor list. Flag the account for standard compliance review. I'll explain context when I'm back in the office Monday. I looked at it for a moment. Then I hit send. I stood outside for another minute, listening to the cold quiet. The neighbor's dog had stopped barking. Somewhere down the street, a door opened and closed. I put my phone in my coat pocket and went back inside. Gerald was still talking about his contract when I sat back down. He had moved on to the subcontractor arrangements and was explaining, to no one's visible interest, the logistics of county-by-county permitting. I poured myself more wine and asked my cousin's wife about her garden. The first call came 18 minutes later. Gerald's phone buzzed on the table beside his plate. He was one of those people who kept his phone face up at dinner, a habit Patrice had clearly long since stopped fighting. He glanced at it, frowned very slightly, and silenced it with one practiced thumb press. He kept talking. The second call came 4 minutes after that. This time he looked at the screen. Before silencing it, his frown was slightly deeper. He kept talking, but something in his rhythm had changed. A fraction of a beat off, like a musician who has heard something in the monitor that doesn't match what they're playing. The third call he picked up. Yeah, he said, and then his expression changed. It was subtle. Gerald was not a man who wore things on his face easily, but I saw it. The slight tightening around the face. The way his chin came down a degree. The way he pushed back his chair almost without realizing it, the scrape of it against Carla's hardwood floor. What do you mean? Flagged? By who? He stood up and walked out of the dining room into the hallway, his voice dropping as he moved. The table went quiet for just a moment, the way tables do when something has interrupted the current, and then reformed around other conversation. Patrice refilled her wine glass and smiled pleasantly at nothing. Bill asked Danny about the game. The children at the far end were arguing about something involving a crayon. Gerald was gone for 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on Carla's microwave, visible through the kitchen pass-through without appearing to watch it. When he came back, he looked like a man who had received news from a doctor. Not catastrophic news, not the worst kind, but wrong news. Something that didn't fit the shape of the day he'd been having. He sat back down and his pie was waiting for him, and he ate it without speaking. He did not resume his story about the contract. He did not make another toast or offer another observation about the nature of success. He ate his pie and looked at his plate, and that was all. For Gerald Donovan, this was unprecedented. This was, in the 11 years I had been coming to this table and sitting at the edge of it, something I had never seen. I had a second slice and talked to my cousin Rebecca about whether her older daughter had decided on the spring musical yet. The full picture did not emerge at the dinner table. It emerged over the following 72 hours in pieces, through channels I was monitoring quietly from my motel room that night and then from my apartment back in the city. What Marcus had done, efficiently, professionally, and with the institutional weight of a firm that held meaningful contracting relationships across the regional infrastructure network, was initiate a standard compliance review of Donovan Construction's vendor status. A flag. Hold. Nothing criminal, nothing punitive in itself. A procedural action with procedural language, the kind that gets sent through systems and generates automated notifications, and puts a quiet pause on things. But in the architecture of federal contracting, a pause is not a small thing. Pause means questions. Questions mean documentation. Documentation means scrutiny. And scrutiny, particularly the organized, federally mandated kind, tends to find whatever is there to be found. The $7.2 million project Gerald had spent 2 years pursuing was not going. But it was suddenly, unexpectedly, under review. The Regional Transportation Authority managing the contract had questions about subcontractor approval chains. The agency overseeing vendor certification had questions about prior project billing. The compliance review, which Marcus had initiated with a single professional flag, had opened a door that the relevant agencies were now, on their own institutional authority, walking through. I want to be precise about what happened next because precision matters and because Gerald is family and because I am not at my core a vengeful person. I had not known about the billing irregularities. That was not something I had targeted or anticipated or engineered. What the compliance review surfaced because compliance reviews are thorough because they go back several fiscal years by standard protocol, because the agencies involved are very good at their jobs, was a pattern of cost overruns on prior federal projects that did not align with documented labor hours and materials invoices. Not dramatic. Not dramatic at all. The kind of thing that, in isolation, might be explained as accounting sloppiness or project mismanagement. But patterns are not isolation. And the federal contracting system is not in the business of charitable interpretation. Donovan Construction was placed on a federal vendor watch list the first week of December. The $7.2 million contract was formally suspended pending review in the second week of January. Gerald hired a compliance attorney in January. He hired a different one in February. I was back at my desk in the city by the Friday after Thanksgiving going through Q4 projections with my operations director when Marcus called to confirm the compliance review was underway and to ask whether I wanted to formalize the vendor removal or leave it as a provisional hold. I told him to formalize it. He asked with the careful neutrality of a man who knows how to ask things professionally whether there was a particular reason for the removal that I wanted documented. I told him it was a conflict of interest concern, which was, when I thought about it, technically accurate in more than one sense. He said, understood. Anything else on this? I told him no. He moved on to the next item on the agenda. We were finished with the topic in under 3 minutes. I did not call Gerald. I did not explain or gloat or find a way to let it filter through the family network that I had been involved. I am aware that some people would have. I am aware that there is a version of this story that ends differently. With a confrontation, a phone call, a revelation at Christmas where the full picture gets laid out across a table and Gerald has to sit with what he'd said and what it had cost him. And aware that there are people who would have needed that. Who would have needed Gerald to know, to understand, to say something that acknowledged the years of dinners and the turkey cutting and the fair enough, said to a laughing table. I found that I didn't need it. I had been surprised to find this out, but it was true. What I know is this. In March, my cousin Danny called me out of the blue for the first time in years. We hadn't talked on the phone since the previous Christmas, and even then it had been brief. He asked how I was doing, what I'd been up to, whether I thought I'd make it to Easter. And then, almost as an aside, the way people mention things they've been wanting to mention since the beginning of the call, he said, Uncle, Gerald's going through some stuff. Business stuff. I don't know if you heard anything. I said I hadn't. There was a pause, the kind that has something sitting in it. Then Danny said, that federal contract he was always talking about. Something happened with it. Got suspended or something. He's been pretty stressed. I told Danny that sounded like a hard situation. I asked about his kids. He told me about his daughter's school play which had gone well and his son's soccer season, which had not, and we talked for 20 minutes about nothing in particular, and it was the longest conversation we'd had in years, and none of it was about what had happened. Some truths settle into a family without announcement. They don't get processed at the dinner table. They don't get named. They just recalibrate things, redistribute weight in ways that nobody formally acknowledges. The loud certainties that everyone had organized themselves around become slightly less certain, and nobody quite says why, and the person who had been decided upon becomes slightly harder to keep decided upon, and the world reorganizes around new facts without admitting that it is doing so. This is how families absorb information they can't explain and wouldn't. I went to Easter. Same table. Same china. Same centerpiece, this time in pastels. Gerald was there, quieter than I had ever seen him at a family gathering. He did not make a toast. He did not tell a story about a project. He talked to his grandchildren and ate his ham and left early because Patrice said smoothly he had somewhere to be. He did not look at me the way he had at Thanksgiving. He didn't look at me with much of anything. I was back to being furniture. The kind of furniture no one comments. I don't know what Gerald knows. I don't know whether he has made the connection between Thanksgiving and what followed. I don't know whether my company's name or Marcus's name ever surfaced in a way that was legible to him. It's possible he has assembled the picture. It's possible he's assembled most of it and left one piece out because leaving it out is easier. It's possible he suspects something shapeless and has chosen not to give it a shape. I have not helped him. That is a choice I made deliberately, and I have sat with it. There is an honest argument for telling him, for sitting down with Gerald Donovan and saying, the person you pointed at across the Thanksgiving table is the person who owns a $60 million company in your industry. The person you called the family embarrassment is the person who had the professional relationships to flag your contract for review. The person you didn't know because you never bothered to know them because you had decided long ago what they were and stopped looking. That person has been here the whole time. There is an honest argument for that conversation. I have considered it. But I keep coming back to the porch. The cold. The flat November dark above the garden. The sound of Gerald's voice still audible through the kitchen window, confident and certain and completely unexamined. And I think about the fact that I sent one message, put my phone away, went inside and ate 2 slices of pie. I was not strategic. I was not calm because I was planning. I was calm because I had, years before that evening, stopped needing Gerald Donovan to understand me. His understanding was not a thing I required. It had not been for a long time. The message wasn't revenge in the way that revenge is usually imagined. Hot, deliberate, performed for an audience. It was something quieter than that. Kind of action that a person who has been very patient for a very long time takes when patience has simply reached its natural end. Not dramatic. Just final. My mother called in February, after the contract situation had become vague. Family knowledge. She didn't ask about it directly. She asked if I was okay, which was her way of asking about several things at once. I told her I was fine, which was true. It was quiet for a moment and then she said, I always knew you'd land somewhere good. You know, I always knew that. I told her I knew she did. We didn't talk about Thanksgiving. We didn't talk about Gerald. We talked about whether I was getting enough sleep and whether I'd had the car in for its service and whether I'd tried the restaurant she'd seen on television. Ordinary things. There is a photograph from that Thanksgiving. Carla sends them every year, the Sunday after, through the family group chat that I have on silent. In this one, the table is mid-meal. Most people are laughing at something, probably one of Bill's jokes, which are reliably mediocre and reliably appreciated. Gerald is at the head of the table with his wine glass raised, and at the edge of the frame, half in shadow because Carla's dining room light has always been too bright on one side and too dim on the other. There I am, not laughing, cutting my turkey. The expression on my face is nothing in particular. The expression of someone who has heard what they've heard and said what they've said and is now returning to the practical business of the meal. I look at that photograph sometimes. I look at how ordinary it is. How much it Looks like every photograph from every family Thanksgiving everywhere. People around a table, people eating, people being whatever they are to each other, which is always complicated and usually kind underneath the complicated parts. Nothing in that photograph looks like a pivot. Nothing looks like anything is happening. Sometimes things don't look like what they are. Sometimes the person at the edge of the frame, cutting their turkey and saying 2 words and going back to the business of pie, is the person the whole table should have been paying attention to. Not because they needed the attention, but because the attention was always already deserved. Fair enough. That was all I said. That was enough.